I recognize the member for Scarborough-Agincourt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On December 13, 1937, Japanese imperial forces initiated a 6-week massacre in the then capital of China, Nanjing. More than 200,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were indiscriminately killed under the command of General Nanjing Massacre. While the precise number of casualties will never be known, this atrocities goes beyond statistics and ethnicity. The Nanjing Massacre is about the tens of thousands of women, young and old, who were sexually assaulted in the capture of the city. It is about women and girls being used as weapons of the war. Those who were non-compliant were beaten and killed. Those who survived this horrific atrocity continue to suffer physically and psychologically in reliving of those memories. They understood the need to record this history, but the numbers of survivors are dwindling and their stories are in danger of being forgotten and lost forever. The Ontario Legislature, Mr. Speaker, has a history of championing for peace and justice for remembering foreign atrocities. Right here before the House, Mr. Speaker, in December 1998, the Legislature passed MPP Ted Achalate's Bill of Holocaust Remembrance Day, Bill 66. This bill received all-party support and is the first of its kind in any jurisdiction in North America. In 2009, the legislature passed Bill 147, which commemorates the victims of the man-made famine of Ukraine. This bill was co-sponsored by MPP Dave Levesque for Brant, along with Sherry DeNovo, MPP for Parkdale High Park, and MPP Frank Cleese, Newmarket Aurora. It was the first tribe-sponsored bill to pass in the history of Ontario. It was passed unanimously consent by the 3 House leaders. In 1980, Mr. Speaker, the legislature also passed a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide committed during World War I and encouraged the government of Canada to take similar steps to encourage remembrance at home and abroad. These bills in motion, Mr. Speaker, passed by this legislature demonstrate Ontario's unified stance on human rights issues, no matter where they occur, and their impact on Ontarians. Last year, my friend, the Minister of Research, Innovation and Science, eloquently stated, quote, "To remember that history is to do justice to the fallen and to safeguard the future from all forms of tyranny, oppressions, racism, and discrimination," end of quote. Passing my motion today, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates Ontario continues to be committed to acknowledging and addressing human rights issues everywhere. The most recent provincial census data shows that Ontario is home to one of the largest Asian populations in Canada. Over 3 million, Mr. Speaker, recorded in 2016. The Asian community has contributed greatly to this province by enriching our cultural diversity. They've also contributed socially, politically, and economically through arts, through wisdom, and social ethics. Almost every Asian who have immigrated to Canada over the past 40 years would have been affected by the events in Asia during World War II to some degree. There are other Ontarians who have a direct relationship with victims and survivors of the Nanjing Massacre. Yet, many Ontarians are unaware of these atrocities that occurred in Asia during the Second World War. It is for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, that I introduce my motion today, declaring December the 13th of each year as Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day for the victims, survivors, and families affected by the Nanjing Massacre. For Ontarians, this is a very important issue, Mr. Speaker, important step for remembrance. It is an acknowledgement of the horrors of the war, an affirmation of our support of global human rights, and a lesson on the history of World War II in Asia. An inclusive society is something that we take for granted as Ontarians. However, as events around the world continue to demonstrate, inclusive values must be continued, reaffirmed, and reinforced. This begins with education. And Mr. Speaker, I know I haven't seen them yet. The students from all over Toronto District School Board, York Region District School Board, and York Region Toronto Catholic District School Board will probably be watching right now. While our education system rightly acknowledges the horrors of World War II, far too often these accounts are from a Eurocentric view and therefore neglected atrocities and legacy of the conflicts in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia. Jerry Conley, currently an Alpha Board member and a former director of the Toronto District School Board, has eloquently argued, and I quote, "Ontario has a strong commitment to equity and inclusive curriculum. You cannot have an inclusive curriculum without one part of the history. We have the responsibility to ensure that our students know and understand the realities of World War II in Asia, end of quote. Alpha Education was founded by Dr. Joseph Wong, who has been a lifelong fighter for social justice since 1979. Inspired by the relentless effort of the Jewish community in reviewing and remembering the horror of the Jewish Holocaust, and appalled by the absence of information and knowledge about the Asian Pacific War, he founded Toronto Alpha in 1997 with a mandate to seek justice for victims and to foster humanity education. Through Alpha Education, hundreds of students in Toronto District School Board, Toronto Catholic District School Board, and York Region District School Board are given an opportunity to learn about the Nanjing Massacre, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, Alpha Education provides resources and support to teachers in these 3 school boards. Students' views of Second World War have been largely presented through their Western lenses, and Asian atrocities are rarely discussed or mentioned in the regular history classes. Dr. Wong believed that this legislature's recognition of Nanjing Massacre, quote, will mean Ontario is truly an inclusive society and in name and in substance. World history includes Asia as well, a huge region where a lot of Canadians trace their history. Through learning of past mistakes in West and as well as in East, we will give our young people the opportunity to learn and think independently and to make past mistakes will not be repeated, end quote. Mr. Speaker, since last December, I tabled over 90,000 signatures of Ontarians, from Sault Ste. Marie to Windsor, to support the establishment of the Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day and the provision for all Ontarians, especially students, to learn about the atrocity of World War II in Asia. To date, Mr. Speaker, to date, no bills or motions have garnered that much talk or discussion within the various communities. There is extensive community support of a day to remember, to honor the victims and families of the Nanjing Massacre and the atrocity of World War II in Asia, as well as the teaching and the learning of these atrocities. The Toronto District School Board, Mr. Speaker, the largest school board in Canada, voted unanimously to recognize Nanjing Massacre in 2008 and provided opportunities for all high school students learning about this atrocity. Passing my motion today, Mr. Speaker, will encourage all Ontario school boards to offer the same opportunities to their students. Last year, the City of Toronto passed a motion by Councillor Jim Kurgianis and Councillor Christian Wong Tam to recognize Nanjing Massacre and declaring December the 13th in the City of Toronto as the Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day. This past April, the Region of Peel, one of the largest municipalities in Ontario, passed a similar motion to recognize Nanjing Massacre. While Nanjing Massacre was one of the most horrific events in Asia during World War II, it is certainly not the only one. Neighboring countries like Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and Philippines, to name a few, faces similar brutalities. And the victims and survivors of Nanjing, these people's voice need to be heard. These voices, along with the voices from other victims of other atrocities, such as the Armenian genocide, Holocaust, Ukrainian famine, Rwanda genocide, and most recently, Mr. Speaker, the ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, will help us to learn about a violent history and build an inclusive tomorrow. Recently, Mr. Speaker, President Obama, who eloquently argued, quote, "We don't rise up by repeating the past. We rise up by learning from the past and listening to each other," end of quote. Designating December 13 in each year as Nanjing Massacre Commemorative Day in Ontario will provide an opportunity for all Ontarians to gather, to remember, and to honor the victims and families affected by Nanjing Massacre. Former Senator, the Honourable Nancy Ruth, argues that this will, quote, enact an annual day of remembrance for victims of the Nanjing Massacre, including the violence directed at women and children. We can never let history repeat itself, end of quote. As a strong advocate for remembrance of Nanjing Massacre is a former MP, Olivia Chow. Ms. Chow and Alpha Education championed the motion of Japanese military sexual slavery in World War II in the House of Commons. It was passed unanimously on November the 28th, 2007. During the debate, Ms. Chow's motion, Minister of Multiculturalism and Canadian Identity, the Honourable Jason Kennedy, stated that, quote, as Canadians, we acknowledge the moments of injustice in our own history, but these women came to this country with a story that needs to be heard, Mr. Speaker, because we need to learn from the lessons of the history. We need to learn the lessons of history to ensure they are not repeated, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, I hope this legislature follows the federal government's footsteps, remembering the victims and families affected by the Nanjing Massacre, and fight for human rights everywhere. The intent of my motion, Mr. Speaker, is to acknowledge and remember the history as it occurs in the hopes of preventing similar actions in the future. This is not, I'm going to repeat, Mr. Speaker, this is not about the Japanese people in Ontario. It is not about today, other than remembering the day and the lesson that history teaches us. I'd like to thank all our guests here today. I'm going to thank you a little bit later, who came from very far to be at Queen's Park to hear this debate and my motion. History is full of teachings, Mr. Speaker. However, we cannot learn from history unless we heed every lesson. While our society and education system rightly recognize the horror of World War II in Europe, too often we neglect the atrocity committed in the rest of the world, particularly in Asia. An inclusive society is one that acknowledges all the truths of history. When we remember the atrocity in the past, we help prevent them from repeating. As I conclude my remark, Mr. Speaker, I want to end by quoting President Obama's recent remark in Virginia. Quote, if we are going to talk about our history, then we should do it in a way that heals, not in a way that divides, end of quote. Passing my motion today, Mr. Speaker, will offer this legislature an opportunity to begin the process of bringing people together, to learn about the atrocities of the past, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, to discuss a new way to build an inclusive tomorrow. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.